Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Julian Gauld. Julian, thank you very much for coming on. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @bettingpod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Julian Gauld. Julian, thank you very much for coming on.
Pleasure, Jake. How are you?
Very well. So you are a Greyhound punter, and I want to get stuck into that. But as always, before we dig in, just a bit about your background, if you can, to get us started here.
I suppose, unlike most of your guests you've had on the show, I don't have a family history in racing. I don't have a family history in gambling either. For me, it all started when I finished school. And a number of my mates and I used to go up to the Cremorne TAB in Sydney on a Saturday afternoon and bet on the horses. I should say that one of the guys I used to go up to the TAB with, a fellow called Chris Hancock, his father, Ron, was a professional gambler and quite successful one back in the 70s and 80s. And Chris used to turn up to the Cremorne TAB with a set of prices for the horses in Sydney and Melbourne. Those prices, I believe, came from a guy called Arthur Harris, who I know a few of your guests have talked about over the last couple of seasons. So he provided the target prices, and for us 18-year-olds just out of school, we found that if we were disciplined, followed the prices, only bet when there was an over, we could make money out of this, which was fantastic. So we used to go to the TAB, and then after a period of time, we graduated from there to going out to the track each Saturday. This is the horses, whether it be Rose Hill or Randwick or Canterbury or Warwick Farm, realising that we're enhancing our chance of getting an over if we had more than just the TAB to bet on, if we had a choice of betting on bookmakers as well. So we did that, and times were good. And after a big day at the races one day, someone suggested, well, why don't we kick on and continue on to the dogs? Let's go to Harold Park, which was open then. It was a Sydney dog track. So we went there afterwards and had a lot of fun. Didn't have Arthur Harris's form, of course, but had a bet. We won some races. We lost some races. But one thing that I discovered there was, whilst I was at the horses, I really had no idea what was going on and how to assess form. I was making some money because Chris brought along these prices, but I couldn't have done that myself. While going to the dogs, I discovered I had a real understanding of what was happening in a greyhound race and what the factors were in terms of determining a winner. So over time, when the rest of the boys didn't go out to the dogs, I continued going to the dogs a couple of times a week. And then after about a year, when I was probably 19 or 20, I started off trying to put markets together, trying to build my own market and have target prices to assess, as I'd seen Arthur Harris do back in the horse racing days. Was I successful in putting my own markets together back in those days? With about a year's experience? Probably not particularly. What I'd say is I minimised my losses, kept my losses very small initially, and then over time developed the sophistication of those markets. So I did move into profitability. Now, whilst I was doing this, I was in corporate life as well, and worked in corporate life for 20 odd years. But all the time at corporate life, I maintained that passion for the dogs. Religiously went out to the dogs twice a week, whether I was living in Sydney, and going out to Harold Park or Wentworth Park. I got transferred up to Brisbane for work between 93 and 98. Went to Albion Park twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and then bet on the Sydney and Melbourne Dogs on a Saturday night. In fact, started dating my wife, who I met in Brisbane in 1993, and informed her early one of the prerequisites of our relationship was that I was unavailable Monday and Thursday nights and couldn't go out on a Saturday night until the Meadows and Wentworth Park finished at about 10:30. I think I might have made an exception for weddings and funerals, but that was about it. So over this time, I kept developing, if you like, my pricing through Brisbane. Went to the UK, transferred to the UK in 2004 to be head of financial planning for the Yorkshire Bank up in Leeds, and in that period discovered Betfair. I think 2004 must have been very early days for Betfair. And back then I was dabbling in a bit of sports betting as well, and really got into the sports betting with Betfair and the in-play betting as well, which of course was legal in the UK. Came back to Australia a few years later, and then in 2009, after a successful corporate career, I was made redundant. But having been with the same company for 20 years, that's got its benefits, because I got a payout, which meant that I wouldn't have to worry in the short to medium term anyway about getting another job in a hurry. Now, during this time, I'd always harboured this dream to be a bookmaker one day. I'd always loved the cut and the thrust of the track, and the colour of the track, and the bookmaker role. And the plan was, well, I'll probably do this when I retire. I'll probably do this at age 60, 65 for a bit of fun. However, after the 20-year stint with my employer, the redundancy check, we went overseas to Europe for 3 months and had to think about my future. And came back and thought, well, I could go out and get another job, but what I'd really like to do is give bookmaking a go for a year. See if I can be successful in bookmaking. If I am, fantastic, I'll keep doing that. If not, well, I'll go back to corporate life and get a job, and I won't die wondering what would have happened if I did that. So wanted to go into bookmaking, wanted to work at the premier track in Australia, Wentworth Park, the only track really where punters could get set with four bookmakers being there. I know historically bookies spend time as a clerk learning the trade and so forth, but Jake, I was in a bit of a hurry. I said I'd give this a go for a year, so I was keen to get straight out there. Also, I'd refined my pricing model to such a degree that I was pretty confident about my pricing. And whilst I'd been doing this pricing, I'd had a full-time, 60-hour week, 70-hour week job as well. So I felt pretty confident if I was doing this full-time, I'd only be able to enhance that further.
So take me back to the very beginning, when you basically realized you had a knack, or you had an ability or a natural sense for the greyhounds, and some of the form factors, some of the things that contributed to the success of greyhounds in a race. What were some of those things that you realized early on?
Okay, I think the obvious thing people look at when they bet on greyhound racing is how fast is the dog relative to the other dogs, and what's its box. I mean, everyone knows box 1's great, box 5, 6 are bad. Well, certainly in Australia. In the UK, of course, they've got seated draws where wide runners are in the wide boxes and railers in the inside boxes and so forth. But they're the obvious things. Next level on that, Jake, is the speed map, of course. And I know most of the punters you talk to in any racing code talk about the speed map imperative. With dogs, probably even more so, because the run to the first turn can be quite short, and there's a high percentage of dogs that lead at the first corner that win. So again, the simplistic way to look at a speed map is look at what are the sectional times the dogs run to the first corner. And again, any half decent greyhound punter, I think, looks at a speed map. So what's the next level beyond that? Next level beyond that's probably what's the running line of the dog to the first corner. And dogs tend to do one of three things in terms of running lines to the first corner. They'll go straight ahead, they'll head towards the rails, or they'll head out wide. So, for example, if you've got a dog in the 1 box that's going to head out wide and a dog in the 2 box that's going to head towards the rails, and they've got similar sections to the first corner, there's a fair chance of a collision there, Jake, at some stage. So maybe you should discount the time those dogs can run to the first corner in that instance. The next iteration of that is, as well as the running line, what's the first step the dog takes when it comes out of a box? That might sound funny, but when a dog comes out of the box, most dogs go straight, but some dogs will just, in that first step, veer to the right, and some will veer to the left. So a dog, for instance, could take a first step, veer to the right, out wide, and then head back towards the rails. And again, if I'm boxed and I head towards the right and the dog outside me heads towards the left, what's going to happen in the first second of the race? There's going to be some sort of collision in all probability. So for me, analysing the form and having a decent depth to analysing that form, to a large degree, understanding what's going to happen in the run to the first corner, understanding what the potential are for collisions or even potential collisions, because if a dog sees a potential collision coming up, Jake, it may go into that collision or it might shy away and check itself out of that. So it's understanding what's going to happen in that run to the first corner. My last step, if you like, in terms of that, I just call in my mind the psychology of the dog. And I don't know what the dog's thinking, but I'm trying to understand what the dog might think. Understand that in a greyhound race, the weights of the greyhounds may vary between a small female dog, a bitch, might weigh down to about 23 kilos, and you might have a male greyhound weighing up to about 40 kilos. Now, to use that extreme example, Jake, imagine a 23 kilo and a 40 kilo dog collide. Who do you think is going to come the better out of that collision? Well, the 40 kilo dog in all probability. But what if the weights are closer together? What if it's a 28 kilo dog and a 30 kilo dog? And what does the 30 kilo dog, does the 30 kilo dog know he's bigger than the 28 kilo dog? And is it confident going into a collision, feeling it'll come out okay, or will it ease out of that collision, thinking it's maybe smaller than that dog? So I'm trying to understand in my form analysis, really in depth what's going to happen in that run to the first corner, what's likely to be the outcome of that, and then have a number of scenarios in terms of how the race can be run, look at the probability of those outcomes, and assign a price to those to come up with 100% market.
How critical is the collision component and the run to the first corner? Is that something that is, 85+% of what's going to happen in a race? And I guess to add to that, how much of it is random or chance? Or you might have some scenarios, but there's always an aspect of it or a large aspect to it is the chance or randomness.
Yeah, I don't like using the word randomness, Jake, because I think dogs are highly predictable. There is a chance element. You're right. There's a dog. Let's say a dog can be a slow beginner, and in all 35 starts of its career miss the start. Then all of a sudden, one start it nails the start. I can't do anything about that. But in all probability, dogs do similar things each race, but they're not machines. They're not machines, so there is some variance in there. And one of the harder parts of form analysis for me, look, you've got to price that in what, that chance that you mentioned. One of the harder parts for me, which I think is measurable, is trying to understand improvement in a dog. And that might be improvement as it gets older and more mature, or it might be improvement in terms of it's used to running 400 metres, now it's running 5, and it gets more stamina each time. So trying to estimate that improvement I find to be quite difficult. And because of that, and because there are some things you can't predict, I tend to discount my market to 80-85% for betting into it, and out to 120% when laying, because there is stuff I can't that I can't predict. There is a margin for error there, but I believe the markets are reasonably inefficient as well. So I can still get a decent amount of bets, betting into an 80-85% market there. An example last night, I had a dog assessed at $3, a $3 favourite called Van An out of the one box. I knew it was a wide runner out of the one box, but there wasn't any speed outside it. I thought it'd get a decent sort of a run. It started at $10, was backed into about $7.50. But people generally, I think, shied away from it because they thought, here's a wide runner in the one box. We don't want to be on it. But if you looked at the dogs around it, you could see that it was likely to get a clear run through to the first corner and handle the box in that instance, albeit normally the one box would be bad for that particular dog.
I want to move over to the bookmaking side now, and I guess, how did it go when you started out the bookmaking, and are there things you might want to change looking back, or did it go perfectly smoothly?
Smoothly is definitely not the word for it, Jake. There are a few roadblocks put in my way, which I didn't count on. I thought going into bookmaking that new bookmakers would be welcomed with open arms. The on-course bookmaking had been in decline for probably the past 10 or 20 years. Prior to this was back in 2009. I mean, a number of your guests I know over the past few seasons have talked about the strength of the bookmaking rings in Australia, and even the dogs where there were 20 or 50 bookies at one stage there. So I thought, given the average age of the bookmakers too, they'd welcome someone slightly younger coming in who'd help ensure the future of the occupation. That wasn't the case. I got a license, albeit they strongly encouraged me to go out and be a clerk first and get some experience and so forth. And where I wanted to field was Wentworth Park, as that was the premier betting track in Australia. There were already 4 local bookings in Wenty Park and no away bookies. So I wanted to come in there as a 5th bookie, but it was knocked on the head. And I was introduced to a term, a closed betting ring. Closed betting ring means no one new can come in. So they didn't want me to come, me or anyone else to come in. The only chance they told me I'd come in is if somebody retired. So, not prepared to take no for an answer, I offered to come in as an away bookie and bet on Albion Park in Brisbane, Angle Park in Adelaide, and Cranbourne in country Victoria as an alternative. That was agreed, and it was also agreed that I could be a reserve for the local ring, and if somebody was sick or couldn't make it, then I'd be welcome to turn up instead in field. Now, having been to the track for many years, one of the things that bemused me a bit was that local bookies were only obliged to take a bet to lose $1,500. Personally, I thought that was a bit soft, and I didn't think that was a way to run a successful business or grow a successful business. So I thought I'd try to shake things up, and I went out there prepared to lose $10,000 on a bet at the dogs. So went out there on the first week. The usual punters were out there. Most of the big punters had deserted the dogs because they couldn't get on anymore. Most of them had, in their words, talking to them later, gone to the horses because at least they could get set, or gone to sports where they could get set. So I was a little bit bemused actually listening to your first guest this season, Jake, who mentioned he fielded the dogs, but ended up moving on because there was no money out there. It's a bit of a chicken egg, isn't it? There's no money out there when you're not prepared to take a bet. Anyway, I went out there prepared to take up to 10 grand on any bet. I didn't do any advertising, but funnily enough, within a week or two, I reckon just about every big punter in New South Wales seemed to converge on the away betting ring in Wenty Park, trying to strip me. As a new bloke they didn't know. They suspected I wouldn't have any idea what I was doing because most new bookies don't, and most of them don't last too long. And it's interesting, I didn't know the names of a lot of these people at the time, but looking back on it now, we had literally some of the biggest punters in the world turn up to Wentworth Park Dogs on a Monday night, wanting to have a bet on Cranbourne Dogs and Angle Park Dogs and Adelaide Dogs. And as one of them said to me, Julian, how good's this? I go to the horses, I can only get on for 5,000. I come to the dogs and I can get on for 10 grand. It's never been better. So started taking their bets, and I think they realised after a bit of time I knew what I was doing and I could hold my own. And certainly from a turnover point of view, I was holding plenty, and I remember the manager at Wenty Park telling me one night that I'd held more than the other bookies in the on-course tote combined. But there's a level of stress, of course, which also goes with taking big bets that I was up for. But it's hard to maintain that poker face sometimes.
How did the other bookies in the ring in general respond to this? It sounds like a bit of a seismic shift in what they're used to. Yeah,
it was. A couple of them were betting bookmakers, so one of them in particular became one of my biggest punters because he was a huge the sort of guy who'd have $100,000 on on a sports bet and so forth. But I think they felt vindicated by not letting me into the local ring, I suspect, Jake. There wasn't a lot of conversation that went on between me and the other bookies there. But I think they felt vindicated in terms of not having business taken away from them. And I think that was the concern over the closed ring, that rather than thinking from a long-term perspective in terms of how do we grow the industry, how do we get more people betting on the dogs, they were just trying to protect their own patch and hold on to their own patch for as long as they could. Couple of memories, couple of good memories from those days. I remember taking a $33,000 bet on a 3s on pop one night. I can remember the name, but Velocity Force up at Brisbane in a lowly 5th grade with $1,300 prize money for first at $1.30. That was a good story because that one got beaten at 3s on. Ended up running second, but certainly got the adrenaline racing. It was a good thing. Another big punter whose name you'd know, but I won't mention. I was down 40 grand to one night. So he called me over towards the end of the night and said, Julian, come and have a chat with me, I came over to him, and interesting enough, I went over to him and I could see there were about 12 blokes then forming a ring around us. And they were pretty much his disciples that follow him around wherever he goes. And he said, mate, you owe me 40 grand. I said, yeah, not a problem, mate. We'll sort it. I'll pay you tomorrow if that's okay. He said, how about we toss for it? And I said, oh, mate, no. He said, let me test how big you are. Why don't you toss for it, mate? You'll take a bet. And I said, no. Then he changed the terms of the equation, Jake. He said, how about I give you $2.10 and you pick heads or tails? Now I know I should have taken the bet, but I didn't. If I could have taken $2.10 every week with him, I would have, because I would have won longer term. But I really didn't want to be down 80 grand to him that night, so I knocked it back. Albeit I've always wondered whether I should have taken that $2.10.
So how did it evolve and change? On course, with obviously much more money coming in, and probably more people coming to the track, and a bigger overall pool of money circulating around. Was that a positive development in that industry, or was it too stifling and unusual for those to latch onto it and ride the wave?
It was positive for Wentworth Park, the club, Jake, because what it meant is with more on-course money, they had more on-course tote turnover, and the club got their funding, I believe, largely through a percentage of on-course tote turnover. So they had a lot of the, as I said, genuinely big, some of the biggest punters in the world come back to the dogs at Wenty Park and have their private betting rooms there, have people in their private betting rooms, commission rooms, I think they call them. So their on-course turnover went up. I'd argue also that the turnover of the other local bookies would have gone up as well. As you had the big money, and as I said, some of these big punters were followed around by a group of disciples who wanted to get some, wanted to follow them in and see what they were backing and so forth there. Same thing happened at Dapto as well. Whilst I was local and looking to work a bit more than 2 days a week, I wanted to field at Dapto, being a Thursday night there, but the main city meeting in a lot of the other cities. Again, I couldn't get a spot in the local ring. There were 2 bookies there already. They were taking bets, would you believe, to lose $500, and they didn't want any competition. So the club decided to protect them and offer me an away space, again, where I was betting to lose 10K. But eventually the local punters there stood up and demanded I be able to field locally. So going back to your question, yes, I think it was absolutely positive for the clubs because it was bringing more people to the track. It was increasing local turnover. I think it was increasing local bookies turnover too, but it was smart money to a large extent, Jake. And it's much harder to beat smart money than it is to beat mug punter money.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask about that. I guess you have to be incredibly confident in your pricing because especially with something like Greyhounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing with a largely illiquid market for most of the time, it's you against the punter almost every time. So it's not like you go to the rails and there's 10 other bookies and there's Betfair and there's tote pricing, or you can see some estimates about that. It's probably you versus them almost every time. Is that fair to say?
It's me versus them every time. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're right. And there was no laying off, and there's no time for laying off too. On the dogs, most of the betting's coming when they're at the boxes 10 or 15, 10 seconds out from the start of the race, Jake. I mean, you're on holding it. You're holding it there. So, I was doing huge turnovers, but from a percentage profit point of view, a lot smaller than I'd say the average bookie who was holding a lot less there. It's interesting because whilst I'd thought bookmaking was the answer at the time, doing this deeper form and doing this full time meant I was punting a lot more as well, and realising I could make good money from punting. And I didn't have to be right all the time to make money from punting. While, as you can appreciate with the bookmaking, I can get 9 out of 10 races right and still lose on the night. If the big money comes in the race I've missed something in. So, that's tough when that happens because, I always like to understand why I've lost. Have I got anything wrong, or is it just, that was a 14% chance of winning, and that was that was just the 14% that played out that race.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, most races I could explain away why I'd lost. Every now and again I couldn't, and often several months down the track I found out why I didn't. So I was punting more and more at the same time because, as I said, I could probably control my winnings more. So punting rather than bookmaking. And after a couple of years of taking on the big boys, I looked back at my numbers versus one punter in particular, who was the toughest punter I was betting against, and I was just in front. And I looked at the swings and roundabouts we'd had, and the stress that I suppose there had been some stress. The stress that had caused along the way, if you like, riding that wave with him. And after a couple of years, I just got on the phone and said, "Hey, mate." I didn't say Bet365 to you. I didn't say become uneconomic to me or whatever they impersonal line. They said, "Hey, I've enjoyed the sport we've had over the past couple of years and the punting, but at the end of the day, I'm eking out very little from you. So I'm going to be decreasing my limits going forward." Because whilst I had that big limit there, Jake, I was attracting all the smart punters to the track. Couldn't seem to get too many big mug punters to the track though.
I can imagine.
Yeah, but anyway, once upon a time they were there, but everyone tells me the big mug punters all go to the casino now.
Yeah, okay. No, that makes sense. I wanted to ask one more question on sort of putting your board up at the track, were you rapidly moving your prices up and down? And maybe a good example is the one you mentioned before. If you rated something $3 and it went up $10 for some reason or whatever and it was into $7.50 like you mentioned, but if that was the case, were you going up first and putting up, $3 in that instance, or were you playing within the market as well and putting it up as $5 instead if a couple of other local bookies had it at $10? How were you able to?
Yeah, I'd go. I wouldn't go up at my actual price, because in a way that's my intellectual property, and I don't want to give that away what I actually think it's worth. So I learned through experience what the right point was to go up here, because what I would have done initially, Jake, is instead of putting up at $10 the other bookies round, I would have put it up at $8. But what I discovered is that other punters might have priced that lower than $8, and I'd end up having it backed with me at $8, which I didn't want.
Well, you can't lay off the 10, right?
People would take the 10s, they'd take my 8s as well. So
yeah.
So I try to go up far enough under, more like the $5 you were talking about there, just to try to avoid taking a bet on it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's not like you can just lay off at $10 once you take the bet at $8. It's probably not that simple in the Greyhound betting arena.
Things firm quickly in the dogs. Like your guest Ben said a couple of weeks ago, I mean, the prices can disappear pretty quickly. So if I don't want to have a bet on something, I've got to have it unders enough that it's going to take quite a few rolls from the other bookies before they get to my price. So I wound back at Wenny Park and still enjoyed the bookmaking there, and wanted to move up decided for lifestyle purposes to move up to the Gold Coast, but was keen to keep fielding on Wentworth Park, having my 2IC run the stand with me on the phone and me just turning up once a month, if you like, showing my face down there. And again, thought that'd be straightforward, Jake, but the New South Wales Bookies Cooperative blocked this and said I couldn't do it. Funnily enough, the ringleader at Wentworth Park, the one who told me the ring was closed, at 4 bookies previously, was pretty senior at the Bookies Co-op, and I suspect this was a matter of trying to get me out of the ring so the other blokes could get a bigger share of the money. Didn't make any sense to me them saying no, because other bookies there seemed to infrequently turn up at the track, but a blind eye was turned to that. Again, I'm a reasonably persistent sort of a guy. And despite my initial understanding that all New South Wales bookies needed to be licensed through the Bookmakers Co-op, someone said to me there's been one exception in the history of racing. Now, I believe it was Robbie Waterhouse, who I was told was directly licensed through Racing New South Wales rather than licensed through the Bookies Co-op. Don't know the history behind that. So I tried to explore that avenue and contacted Greyhound Racing New South Wales to see whether they'd licensed me directly on the terms and conditions that I talked about, operating from the Gold Coast and not being there every week. They didn't know whether they could do that, but explored and found out they could, but then were dragging their heels in making a decision, having me lodge my bookmaker's guarantee with them rather than the co-op and so forth. So just to stir things up a bit, I had a chat with Jeff Collison. Jeff was the Greyhound journalist at the Daily Telegraph. Actually, he was the Greyhound journalist and the wine columnist at the Daily Telegraph. Good combination. And he wrote an article about this situation from the telly, and funnily enough, in a day of him publishing it, Greyhound Racing New South Wales approved me operating at Wenny Park from the Gold Coast. So kept doing that for another four or so years, flying down each month, and then a couple of years ago, more from the point of view in terms of wanting to spend more time with the family, just decided to give the bookmaking side away and just concentrate on the punting.
Overall, you happy with how it all went on the bookmaking side? It sounds like there was some decent battles going on over the years.
Oh, it was great fun. No, I wouldn't have changed anything for quids, Jake. As I said, it was a dream of mine, ever since I started going to the dogs, and I'm grateful I, had the guts to have a go and live that dream. I met some fascinating people in that time as well and made some great connections, and, I've maintained relationships with some of those punters rather than bookmakers in particular I've met through that time, and they've provided other opportunities for me over the years in terms of places they were betting. I know one of your guests a few weeks ago was talking about CityBet as an example, which was, for those of you who don't know, an Asian betting exchange. I mean, I've been introduced to that and a number of other betting opportunities through some of these connections I've made there. So absolutely no regrets. And learned plenty. I think got some respect from some of the big players in the industry, and once getting that respect, then they were happy to share information with me and me with them as well in terms of how we do various things. I wouldn't be where I was today if I was just, as I call it, sitting in a dark room doing form, which is effectively what I do. I don't talk to trainers, I don't talk to owners or anything like that. But through talking to a number of the punting identities I've met over this time, I've been able to validate a number of things I've got, and had a few things challenged that I do. So yeah, it's been fantastic.
What's it like in 2018 as a greyhound punter now? Is it a thriving marketplace? Is it pretty slow and is not trending in an upward direction? Take me through your thoughts generally on how the industry is at as a greyhound punter now.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the published industry figures, you'd come away thinking it's a growing, thriving industry, because year after year, turnover on greyhound racing has been increasing in an absolute term and increasing versus the other two at a faster rate than the other two racing codes. I think if we go back 15, 20 years ago in New South Wales and Victoria, I think greyhound racing was about 13% of overall racing turnover. These days, I think it's closer to probably about 21%. But it's also growing strongly in absolute term. So you might think that's very positive, but it's not. It's not all that it seems. The way that growth has been achieved is putting on more and more and more race meetings. So instead of there being, say, 2 or 3 greyhound race meetings a day throughout Australia that the TAB and the bookies bet on, corporates bet on, today there'll probably be about 10 or 12 greyhound meetings. So it's been funded through increased number of races. But what that's also meant is, firstly, the turnover per race has gone down on average, which is not a positive for the punter. And then second, there's the question of where do you get set these days? And it's a struggle. Back in the old days when corporates were owned by Australians, were owned locally, I think the corporates understood that bookmaking was, about the cut and the thrust. You don't win all the time. You win sometimes, you lose sometimes. If you're losing against a punter, you try to learn from them. And as a number of your previous guests have said, you try to take their bets as a lead to massage your market and win overall. While the English and Irish corporates who have taken over, fair dinkum, they're an absolute shocker. They're just interested in signing up mugs, effectively. They're not even interested, I believe, in holding people they believe may become profitable in the future. If they're backing conveyances that are forming in the betting. So despite some of them, Bet365, we all know over the last few years has had some, well, certainly in greyhound racing, some hugely mispriced some dogs on a regular basis. But they're one of the quickest to cut you off. And I'm not saying I did this, but recently there's been criminal action launched against some punters who had been using bowlers, which I think is outrageous. But that certainly, I think stops anyone employing the old bowler strategy in terms of betting with corporates. So for me, corporates are pretty much dead. There's minimum betting legislation in the horses. And I believe there's some in one state in the harness racing. At the moment, there's none in greyhound racing. Victoria's put out a proposal to do one, but the sooner we get that up and running, the better from my point of view. So corporates at the moment are dead to me, but hopefully minimum bet legislation changes that.
Rethink the way you see sport. Every action or play can be represented by a series of numbers. When you analyse this data, patterns begin to emerge. If you follow these patterns and develop systems, you can play the game within the game. Betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
The merger of the TABs, keeps getting held out as a huge positive for punters. Certainly that's the way they framed it when trying to get it approved by the regulator. For me, it's a huge negative, because they'll have a monopoly once they merge. And as we know, what does a monopoly do? It puts prices up, puts takeouts up. And I know over the past 10 years, a lot of big punters have got out of betting with the TABs as the rebates the TABs have been paying have come down, and punters who relied on those rebates to make their model work have been getting out. So I would have thought they'll disappear completely when the TABs merge, and I fear in terms of what's going to happen with the takeout. The one positive sign there is there's a potential competitor to the TAB on the horizon, I believe, which is proposing smaller takeouts and looking to have a more global and domestic offering. So for me, it's fingers crossed in that space. That being said, the TABs on a fixed odds basis, it's easier to get set with than it is with the corporates. The tabs, firstly, I don't know what's happened, but in the last year or so, they seem to be prepared to take bigger bets than they were previously. Of course, also, they've got cash betting terminals, whether it's UBet up here in Queensland or the other TABs around the country. And for the punter, the cash betting terminals are wonderful. And then, of course, there's Betfair. We love Betfair. There's good liquidity on Betfair in the Greyhound markets. I mean, I was betting on Sandown last night, and quite regularly we were getting $25,000, $30,000, $35,000 on a race held. And on that same race, you might have had $9,000 on Super Tab, $6,000 on New South Wales Tab, and $2,000 on Tatsbet. So you're getting liquidity in greyhound racing on Betfair. And for anyone that bets on the dogs in Betfair, you might have noticed over the last year or so in the big dog betting meetings in Victoria and WA, there's good liquidity in the market a race before the race starts. There's a market of around 120, 125% there, which at that point of time I believe is the best market in the country, better than the percentages the corporates have got up and better than the percentages that the tabs have got up. So, for me, a lot of the business is done these days through Betfair, or it's done through fixed odds, where I can get on. From a pari-mutuel point of view, would love to bet in there, but with the size of the pools, you can't have a decent bet without moving the market too much. My betting on pari-mutuels tends to be more around quadrillas, first fours, where there's a big jackpot pool playing into it. And of course, when there's a big jackpot pool, effectively the house margin is erased. So I wouldn't call it a bleak landscape at the moment, but it's certainly not particularly healthy. If it weren't for Betfair, it'd be damn tough getting a bet on Jake.
So take me through the actual impact of having bets limited, accounts restricted, you can't get on, you're not willing to engage with the tote pools, for example. Does that cause things like, you haven't been able to bet on maybe 2 or 3 dogs that you liked, and then finally you're able to get a bet on? Do you tend to then overbet, or does it cause other frustrations which have a negative impact, or are you pretty much understanding of that and keep the discipline in order, otherwise it can be problematic?
Oh, look, for me, it's so much about discipline. If I've got a target price, as I said, I'll discount the market when betting down to 80 to 85, depending on my confidence on the race. I have to get that target price. I have to be, true to my philosophy. Mispricing for me is most likely to occur in the opening market. So I'll be rushing in the morning to do a first market and trying to finish that first market before the opening markets go up. Generally, though, I won't get set for as much as I'd like on those opening markets, but I can often lock in, some good overs there. I'll then in the afternoon, fine tune those markets. But if I can't get set for as much as I can, well, that's just the way it is. I don't take the $2.90 instead of the $3 because the way I see that, it's a slippery slope. If I'm taking the $2.90 instead of the $3, then why won't I take the $2.80 instead of the $2.90? And I'm getting closer and closer to my $2.50 that I actually had it assessed at. And I know there has to be a good margin of error priced into my market. So it's frustrating. I mean, in the perfect world, I'd always be able to get set for what I wanted at the appropriate price, but that's just not the betting landscape. So I've just got to deal with that and see whether I can make the model work.
So has that caused you to change any of your philosophies or your approach to staking and bankroll management, or have you just, if you can't get a bet down at the right number based on your ratings and pricing, you're happy just to sit back and watch?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't have any, regret at the moment. I mean, just talking about the staking, my staking actually is quite similar to your harness racing guest a few weeks ago, to Ben. And just to run through that, as an example, let's say I'm staking to win $1,000 a race and my price is $250. If I discount $250 by down to 85%, $250 turns into $2.96, which I'll round up to $3 because I won't get $2.96 obviously with corporates and with the tower. Round it to $3 and see if I can get set at that. So if it's $3 and I'm betting to win 1,000, my bet will be 500. However, that example last night with Van An, it opened at 10. Now, I didn't average out at 10. I averaged out at $8 on it. So I still, in that example, if I was betting to win 1,000, would have had $500 on. But instead of winning 1,000, would have won 3,500, being the $8 price there. But, I mightn't be able to get set for all that I want to get set at. So that's the way it is. I've got to sit back and watch it. But, I sit back and watch it if it wins, with some regret that I wasn't fully set, but with some pleasure that I got the price right. So, I think all punters, no matter what the environment, have to deal with that issue. Jake, for me, betting's all about discipline. Does my betting strategy change over time? Of course it does. I mean, I review my betting strategy and philosophy every 6 months. I have what I call a deep dive review, where I look at it and analyse it and think are there any tweaks I can make to make it better, or to respond to the betting environment and so forth there. And an example of that might be, because of the inability to get set on win betting, I started a year or two doing place markets as well. Place markets aren't necessarily just the win market divided by a set number, because in dog racing, different dogs have a different chance at a place. There might be a dog that's Van An last night, its place odds would have been a lot more than, say, a quarter of its win odds, because if it didn't lead, it was up near the lead, it had no chance of running a place. While another dog that's a run-on dog might have been $3, but say $1.10 a place. So I developed, some place betting markets to try to, pick up some extra revenue on that side where I could find overs. Less likely, less often than win betting, but opportunities arise there as well. So it is a matter of continually evolving, but for me, it's got to be very disciplined why I'm making a decision outside of my philosophy. And if I'm making a decision, it's not a one-off, it's a structural change in terms of how I approach my betting.
So in that example you just shared earlier, if you rated it or you rounded it up to $3, you would bet 500 to win your $1,000 amount. If it was $8 or $10, you'd still bet $500. Did I interpret that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. If I just assessed it at 3, the staking amounts all based on the price I assess it at to back. Yeah.
And if you got 50 to 1, you would still bet 500 on it if you could.
Absolutely.
Okay. And
absolutely.
So in those instances where there's a wide varying gap, obviously the one side of the coin is you've got a clear edge in your mind, so therefore it's worth having that amount on it. But do you ever get worried that you're missing something, or the market's potentially closer to the right price or the better price, or are you just backing in and know that over the long term you'll be on the right side of even those bets that have varying prices versus your assessed price and the actual market price?
I think both. Actually, Jake. I'm always looking at what I'm missing, trying to think what I'm missing. Because in that same race last night, the dog in the 6th Fernando Express, I think it was, I'd assessed at 20 to 1, and it was $2.80. It was second favourite in the market, and I kept thinking, I missed something. I missed something here. And of course, I miss stuff. From time to time. But more often than not, I think I'm going to be right. The reason I discount the pricing down to 85% is to take into account the fact that yes, I might miss something from time to time. But if I miss stuff on a regular basis, I'd be losing money hand over fist, I suspect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So have you got any advice for those who might be interested in getting more involved in greyhound punting, and maybe they had a passion for it growing up, or set it to one side for a while and are coming back a little fresh? Would you have any tips for those types of people, on the punting side or the industry in general side, or some things you've done that have worked well that you're okay sharing?
Yeah, I think like with any punting, Jake, you need to really commit time into your analysis of the race and the potential way the race is going to run. As I mentioned earlier, that run to the first corner is so imperative, and it's not just all about speed. So I think if anyone's interested in ramping up their greyhound betting, they've really got to be looking closely at that run to the first corner and understanding more than just the speed map, but thinking about what's going to get through unscathed, or if there are a whole lot of potential interference in that run, what's the back marker? What's the back marker that's going to get a run through and maybe come from last? So it's just like anything, whether it's betting or anything you do, if you put the time in and the work and really try to gain an excellent understanding and then have discipline in terms of how you execute your strategy, you'll get more pleasure and you'll lose less money, or maybe win money by betting.
How do you gather new ideas and even share ideas with other people or peers in the industry? Is there a good way to do that in the greyhound world? Obviously, being at the track seems like in the past was one of the best ways, but what about in this day and age?
No, I don't think. There's no real network that I'm aware of, a formal network, Jake. I every now and again just get on the phone to a couple of people I know and respect and talk about things. And as I said, if I hadn't been through that bookmaking phase, I wouldn't have met those people, because it's a lonely life, punting. I mean, working back in the corporate world, I walk into an office every day and there are people I could bounce things off. I mean, working sitting in a home office, you've got to make the effort and get on the phone to talk to people. I think that's invaluable. I mean, often it'll just help validate what I already know, but I need people to. Sometimes you just want that peace of mind. You're doing the right thing to move forward.
Yeah, it seems like one of the areas these days that it's hard to really bounce ideas off people if you're at home office all day and you're betting and there's a lot of content out there. Even if you're a greyhound punter or horse racing, whatever it might be, sports, you could be doing form and assessing prices all day every day and not have a chance to get out and see what else is going on, see what other approaches there are and what's changed in the last 6, 12, 18 months.
Yeah, there is some good reading. I mean, I read books as well, and I know some of your other interviewees over the years have as well, but Wisdom of Crowds is one that gets mentioned a lot, and I think that's relevant to some extent with the dog markets, particularly the final market there. Sportscasting is a fascinating book. I don't know if you've read that one, Jake.
No, I don't think I have, actually.
Well, do yourself a favour on that one. Not relevant to greyhound betting, but I've got some mates that are sports bettors, and fascinating in terms of understanding refereeing decisions in regards to hometown teams and everything in every sport around the world. And in terms of structure and process in what you do, an absolute classic is The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. Been around 20 or 30 years, but if you need convincing as to why you should have structure, process and discipline in what you do yourself a favour and read The E-Myth.
Yeah, no, there's a number of great books out there that can help outside of the specific area to sort of put good process in place and good framework around what's already being done, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, Julian, I really appreciate your time. It's been great fun chatting. Greyhounds is an area that I certainly don't get to talk about all the time. So it was great of you to share some of your insights and experience for the podcast.
No, pleasure, Jake. Thank you.